The steady rhythm of the autumn rain against the windowsill filled the quiet tension in our spacious living room. The house, once my safe haven on the outskirts of town, now felt suffocating. My father's piercing gaze locked on me, heavy with disappointment and barely contained anger. I stood there, twisting the edge of my sweater with trembling fingers, feeling my heart pounding so hard it seemed ready to burst. When I admitted the truth to him, that I was pregnant, his reaction was as cold and cutting as I had feared. His quiet demand to repeat myself only deepened the pit in my stomach. I barely managed to whisper the words again, my voice fragile and my cheeks wet with tears. The mention of Kevin, his name, his role in my life, only intensified my father's disdain. To him, Kevin wasn't a partner or someone I loved, he was a mechanic, someone unworthy of me, someone whose old car symbolized everything my father despised. I tried to defend Kevin, to paint him as the good, hard-working man I knew him to be, but it didn't matter. My father's fist slammed onto the table with a force that made the cups in the cabinet rattle, a sharp punctuation to his declaration that I was throwing my life away. His words were sharp reminders of everything he had done for me, sending me to the best schools, ensuring I had opportunities, mapping out what he thought my future should be. Now, he saw it all unraveling because of my choice. I tried to stand my ground, insisting that I loved Kevin and that we planned to marry, but my father dismissed it outright. There would be no marriage, he declared. Instead, there would be a solution, one he intended to arrange for me immediately. His words turned cold and practical, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions surging through me. But as he spoke, a fierce protectiveness rose in me. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms around my stomach, shielding the life growing within me. This wasn't just my father's disappointment or my future at stake anymore. This was my child. And I couldn't let him take that away from me. When he questioned how I would survive, where I would live, or what I could possibly offer a baby, his doubts cut deeply, but they didn't break me. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing with certainty: I wasn't going to give up my child. My mother entered the room then, her presence softening the suffocating atmosphere for just a moment. She looked between us, confused and concerned, and when my father explained the situation with sharp sarcasm, her hand flew to her chest. The hurt in her eyes mirrored my own, but it was layered with something else, fear, perhaps, or disbelief. When she turned to me for confirmation, her expression was a mix of heartbreak and pleading, as if hoping my father's words were some cruel misunderstanding. The rain outside continued to fall, relentless and cold, much like the storm brewing within the walls of our home. The life I had known, the stability of my family, felt as though it were slipping away. But amidst the chaos, I clung to the fragile hope growing inside me, the knowledge that I was already fighting for my future and for the life of my child. I wanted my mom to understand, to see that I wasn't ruining my life but choosing a path I believed in. Yet her reaction, like my father's, made me feel as if I were an outsider in my own family. My father's voice grew louder, cutting through the tension. His anger was no longer simmering, it was boiling over. He demanded to know if I'd thought about him, about the family, and about how the town would react. His pride and reputation weighed heavier on him than my own happiness or future. This was my life, not his. The judgment of the town, of anyone else, meant nothing to me compared to what I was fighting for. He didn't stop, though. His words came sharp and unrelenting, a reminder of everything he had done for me, paying for my education, providing me with everything I'd ever needed. And yet, it wasn't enough for him to hold that over my head. He made it clear that as long as I lived under his roof, I would follow his rules. I realized then that his love and support were conditional, tied to my compliance with his vision of my future. That realization solidified something in me. I would leave. I would go to Kevin. My mother sobbed at my words, her face crumpling as she begged me not to make this decision. I wanted to reach out to her, to make her understand, but I couldn't waver now. Her pleas felt like another chain trying to hold me back. My father's next words came with cold finality, his sarcasm biting. He dismissed me, mocking my choice, and disowned me in the same breath. I felt the floor drop out from under me as he declared I was no longer his daughter. My mother cried out, horrified by his cruelty, but he doubled down, giving me an ultimatum that shattered any lingering hope of reconciliation. I either ended the pregnancy or left his house for good. For a moment, I stood frozen, my father's words echoing in my mind. This wasn't the home I had grown up in anymore. It was a battlefield where love and control had become entangled. The realization hit me like a punch. I couldn't stay. I had already made my choice, even if it meant walking away from everything I had ever known. I walked to my room, the heaviness of my father's disapproval and my mother's despair pressing down on me with every step. My hands shook as I opened my closet, pulling out a backpack. I packed only the essentials, trying to move quickly before my resolve wavered. Documents, clothes, my laptop, my phone, just the bare necessities. Everything else, the mementos of my childhood, the comforts of my old life, felt like they belonged to someone else now. As I turned to leave, my mother stood in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. Her voice broke as she begged me to reconsider, to see my father's actions as his way of protecting me. Her words stung, but they couldn't reach me anymore. Her vision of what was best for me didn't align with mine. Forcing me to give up my child wasn't love or protection, it was control. I zipped up my backpack with a finality that matched my decision. I told her to stop, to let me go, because my mind was made up. Her sobs followed me as I left the room, as I walked away from the life I had always known and toward a future that, while uncertain, was mine to claim. I took one last look around my room, letting the memories wash over me. At the front door, I hesitated, turning back for one final glance. My father stood rigid, his back to me, staring out the window as if I had already disappeared. He refused to look at me, and the deliberate coldness of his posture stung more than any words he could have said. My mother stood nearby, leaning against the doorway, her quiet sobs breaking the heavy silence. Without another word, I stepped out into the rainy night, the door closing behind me with a quiet finality. The cold rain hit me instantly, soaking through my light jacket as I walked down the driveway. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, dialing Kevin's number. Each ring felt like an eternity until his voice finally came through. The moment I heard his familiar tone, the tears I had been holding back threatened to overwhelm me. I told him I had left home, the words tumbling out in a rush. His concern was immediate, and he promised to come for me right away. I stood there in the rain, shivering as the reality of what I had done began to sink in. The house loomed behind me, dark and unwelcoming, while the street ahead felt empty and uncertain. But I had made my choice, and there was no turning back. 15 minutes later, Kevin's old Toyota Corolla pulled up in front of me, its headlights cutting through the rain. He jumped out, rushing toward me without hesitation. His concern was written all over his face as he helped me into the car, his hands gentle but firm as they guided me out of the storm. The warmth of the car's heater enveloped me, and for the first time that night, I felt safe. The weight of the evening hit me all at once, and I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Between gasps, I tried to explain what had happened, how I had told my parents about the pregnancy and the fight that followed. The words came in fragments, interrupted by tears, but Kevin didn't rush me. He simply sat beside me, his presence steady and comforting, whispering that everything would be okay. He drove us to his one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was small but inviting, with a lived-in coziness that felt like a much-needed refuge. Pots of violets sat on the windowsill, a touch of warmth and life that Kevin explained had belonged to his grandmother. The apartment itself, though modest, carried an undeniable sense of care and history. It was far from the home I had left behind, but it already felt more welcoming. Kevin helped me out of my damp jacket and handed me a blanket, his concern evident in every movement. As I sank onto the couch, he sat beside me, holding my hand as we talked late into the night. He told me he had been thinking about our future for a long time, quietly planning and saving to make sure we could build a life together. Despite everything, his optimism was unwavering. He shared that he had some savings set aside and had already arranged to take on extra shifts at the auto shop to help us get by. His words weren't just promises, they were a reassurance that we were in this together. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time that day, I felt a glimmer of hope. This little apartment, this shared determination, it wasn't much, but it was ours. And that was enough for me. Despite everything, I had made the right choice. He was my safe place, my anchor in a storm that seemed determined to uproot me. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had ever faced. I tried calling my mom, hoping for even a small glimmer of reconciliation, but every call went unanswered. My dad had blocked my number entirely, shutting me out of their lives without hesitation. Without their financial support, I was forced to drop out of university. The decision crushed me. All the dreams I had once nurtured seemed to slip through my fingers, but I had no other option. Survival became my priority. Kevin stepped up in ways that made me love him even more. He worked tirelessly, picking up extra shifts at the shop, repairing cars for clients at their homes, and even responding to emergency calls late at night. He came home exhausted, the weariness etched into his face, but he always managed to smile when he saw me. That smile, no matter how small, kept me going. I knew I couldn't let him carry the weight alone. I searched for anything I could do from home and finally found a remote job as a call center operator. It didn't pay much, but it was something, a small way to contribute. Together, we quickly learned how to budget every dollar, plan meals down to the penny, and find small joys in the life we were building. Kevin amazed me with his resourcefulness, fixing our old washing machine, repairing a leaky faucet, even painting the apartment walls a cheerful yellow. Slowly, our little space transformed into a home, filled with love despite its modest size. Then came the evening that turned everything upside down. I felt an unusual tightness in my stomach, an ache that didn't go away. At first, I convinced myself it was just normal pregnancy discomfort. But as the hours passed, the pain grew worse. Panic gripped me, and when Kevin came home, I could barely get the words out to explain what was happening. He didn't waste a second. In record time, he had me in the car and on the way to the hospital. The doctor's words were a blur: threatened miscarriage, strict rest, no stress or physical activity. Each phrase felt like a blow, and my heart shattered at the thought of losing the baby. I couldn't stop the tears as they explained the precautions I needed to take. Later that night, lying in bed, my mind raced with guilt and worry. Kevin was already doing so much, and now I couldn't even manage the small contributions I had been making. How could I ask more of him when he was already giving everything? Kevin, as always, seemed to sense my turmoil. He sat beside me, taking my hand in his strong, calloused grip. His words were steady and certain, grounding me in a way nothing else could. He reassured me that he would take care of everything, that the baby and I were his priority now. His determination was unwavering, and for the first time that day, the knot of fear in my chest began to loosen. I spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital, under constant observation. The days were long and isolating, but Kevin never missed a single visit. He brought me fresh fruit and juice, sat by my side for hours, and read books aloud to distract me from my anxiety. Each time he walked into the room, the weight of my fears lifted just a little. One day, he arrived holding a tiny pair of baby booties, soft and pale blue. He looked almost shy as he showed them to me, admitting that he hadn't been able to resist when he saw them at the store. The sight of those tiny shoes brought tears to my eyes, not tears of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude and love. In that moment, I realized just how lucky I was to have Kevin by my side. Despite the challenges, the uncertainty, and the sacrifices, I knew we could face whatever came next. Together, we were building something stronger than fear, a life shaped by love and resilience. After I was discharged from the hospital, everything changed. The doctors had been clear: complete rest was non-negotiable. I had to quit my call center job, leaving us with just Kevin's income. Financially, things were tighter than ever, but somehow, we managed. Kevin's determination and optimism carried us through even the most difficult days. One afternoon, as I was organizing the small closet in our apartment, I came across an envelope tucked into the back corner. Inside were Kevin's savings, the money he'd been putting aside for years to open his own auto repair shop. My stomach sank as I realized what he had been doing. The money wasn't for his dreams anymore, it was going toward my medication, prenatal vitamins, and the healthy meals he insisted I needed. When I confronted him about it, he didn't flinch. His focus, as always, was unwavering. He reassured me that the shop could wait, that nothing mattered more than my health and the baby's. His selflessness both warmed my heart and filled me with guilt, but I knew better than to argue. Kevin had made his choice, and it was clear he would sacrifice anything for us. By the time I reached my 7th month, we decided to get married. There wasn't room in our lives, or our budget, for anything elaborate, but we didn't need a big wedding to make it meaningful. On a quiet weekday morning, we walked hand in hand into the registrar's office. I wore a simple dress I had altered myself to fit my growing belly, and Kevin wore the only suit he owned, the one he had bought for his high school graduation. The ceremony was short and simple, but when Kevin took my hand and smiled at me, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. We celebrated afterward with lunch at a tiny cafe near our apartment. It was modest, a cup of fruit tea and a slice of cake for me, and coffee for Kevin, but it felt perfect. We didn't need extravagance, we had each other, and that was enough. Later that night, as we lay in bed, the baby kicked for the first time. Kevin placed his hand on my belly, his grin lighting up the room. We hadn't found out the baby's gender, wanting to keep it a surprise, but in moments like this, I could see how much Kevin hoped for a son. For me, it didn't matter. I just wanted the baby to be healthy. At 37 weeks, everything came to a head. It was the middle of the night, and Kevin had just come home from a late shift. The contractions started suddenly, sharp and undeniable. Panic bubbled up as I woke him, barely able to form the words. He didn't hesitate, springing into action with an urgency that calmed my fear even as the pain intensified. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Kevin broke every traffic rule imaginable, weaving through the streets with a single-minded focus on getting me there safely. The moment we arrived, the staff rushed me into the delivery room, leaving Kevin behind as the doors swung shut. His voice carried after me, shouting reassurances that everything would be fine. The hours that followed felt endless. Every contraction, every moment of pain was tempered by the thought of holding my baby for the first time. For Kevin, those 6 hours waiting outside were the longest of his life. I knew he was pacing, probably running through every worst-case scenario in his mind, but I also knew he was as ready as I was to meet the little life we had worked so hard to protect. Finally, a nurse emerged from the delivery room and called out to him. We had a healthy daughter, 3 kilograms, 200 grams, 50 centimeters. When they let Kevin into the room, I watched as he approached, his steps tentative but filled with awe. His eyes glistened with tears as he leaned over to see her for the first time. She was perfect, with tiny chubby cheeks and miniature fingers that curled slightly in her sleep. Kevin's breath caught as he gently whispered to her, his voice breaking with emotion. The love in his expression made my own tears fall freely. The first few months with Sophia were the hardest of our lives. Sleepless nights blurred into exhausting days, her cries echoing through the small apartment. Diapers, feedings, and an endless stream of responsibilities left us both running on fumes. There were moments when I felt completely overwhelmed, crying quietly while Sophia napped, but never once did I regret the path I had chosen. Her tiny presence filled my life with purpose and love. Kevin worked harder than ever, pushing himself to the brink to make sure we had enough. He took every job he could find, from fixing cars to washing them and even taking odd repair jobs around the neighborhood. Despite his exhaustion, he always found time to cradle Sophia in his arms at the end of the day, making silly faces or softly humming to her before collapsing into bed. Watching them together reminded me that even in our struggles, we had built something beautiful. When Sophia was 3 months old, an unexpected encounter shook my carefully built world. While out for a walk with her stroller, I saw my mom. She froze when her eyes landed on me, her face a mixture of shock and longing. I stopped, unsure of what to say, but before I could react, she whispered my name, her voice trembling with emotion. She asked if she could see the baby, her request hesitant but filled with an unmistakable yearning. I hesitated, my mind torn between the pain her absence had caused and the undeniable love in her voice. Finally, I pulled back the blanket covering Sophia. My mom gasped softly as she looked at her granddaughter, sleeping peacefully, her tiny hand clutching a pacifier. Tears streamed down her face as she murmured how beautiful Sophia was, her voice breaking when she asked for her name. When I told her it was Sophia, a faint smile appeared on her tear-streaked face. She then asked if she could visit us, quietly and without my father knowing. Her plea was filled with pain and guilt, and I could see how much it cost her to even ask. I hesitated again, but the love in her eyes was impossible to ignore. I nodded, and relief washed over her face. From that day forward, my mom began visiting us in secret. She would bring diapers, baby clothes, and small toys, always careful to buy them bit by bit from different stores so my father wouldn't notice. Her visits were bittersweet, a reminder of the fractured relationship with my family but also a testament to the love that still remained. Slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild a fragile connection, one centered on Sophia and the hope she brought to all of us. During one of my mom's visits, she sighed heavily as she sat on the couch, watching Sophia play with her favorite stuffed animal. She told me my father still refused to hear my name spoken in the house. He called me a disgrace to the family, his words cutting deep even though they were delivered secondhand. I stayed quiet, swallowing the lump in my throat. The wound from his rejection still felt too raw to touch, and I didn't have the energy to fight it anymore. When Sophia turned 1, we decided to throw a small celebration. It wasn't much, just a gathering of people who had become our support system, Kevin's friends from the auto shop, our kind neighbor who often helped with Sophia, and my mom, of course. Kevin had spent 3 days watching YouTube tutorials, determined to bake Sophia's birthday cake himself. When he carried it out from the kitchen, proudly announcing his masterpiece, everyone cheered and clapped. The cake was a little lopsided, but to me, it was perfect. Seeing his pride and effort made my heart swell. Sophia, already walking unsteadily, toddled around the room, clutching onto furniture for balance. She was the perfect blend of us, my blue eyes and Kevin's dark curls, her little face lighting up every time someone smiled at her. She giggled as she made her way toward Kevin, and when he scooped her up, spinning her in the air, her laughter filled the room. Watching them together, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for everything we had built. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had love, laughter, and our little family, and that was more than I could have hoped for. Sophia grew into a bright and curious little girl. Her laughter became the soundtrack of our days, her endless questions keeping us on our toes. My mom came to visit often, sneaking in gifts like new outfits or toys. During one of her visits, as she watched Kevin play with Sophia on the floor, spinning her around while she squealed with delight, she turned to me. She admitted she had been wrong about Kevin, calling him a wonderful father and husband. Her words filled me with pride, and I smiled, replying softly that I had always known that. Slowly, life began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. Kevin was promoted to senior mechanic at the auto shop. The pay increase wasn't much, but it was enough to afford a new washing machine, finally replacing the old one that Kevin had been patching up for months. I started tutoring kids in English from home, carefully timing the lessons during Sophia's naps. The extra income wasn't much, but it helped cover the cost of diapers and baby food. Every little bit made a difference. One evening, as we were putting Sophia to bed, she surprised us in the most extraordinary way. With her big blue eyes looking up at us, she clearly said her first words, "Mama and Daddy." Kevin and I froze, staring at her in disbelief before breaking into laughter and tears. The moment felt suspended in time, a gift reminding us of how far we had come. As we stepped out of her room, Kevin turned to me, his voice soft and full of emotion. He told me he was the happiest man in the world because he had me and Sophia. I squeezed his hand, unable to find the words to respond. I didn't need to. In that moment, everything we had gone through, every struggle, felt worth it. Together, We had built a life that was simple, imperfect, and yet entirely beautiful. Time passed quickly, and Sophia blossomed into a bright and curious little girl. By the time she turned 2, she was already recognizing letters, and by 3, she was reading simple words. Kevin would tease her, joking that she was destined to be a scientist, but Sophia would puff out her little chest and insist that she would grow up to fix cars just like her daddy. Her determination made us laugh, but I could already see traces of Kevin's grit and my curiosity in her. When Sophia turned 5, everything began to shift. Kevin, who had spent years working tirelessly and studying, finally earned his master certification as a top-tier auto mechanic. It was a monumental achievement, opening new doors for him. One evening, over dinner, he shared the exciting news that he had been offered a position at an official BMW service center, with the possibility of a training program in Germany. I couldn't have been prouder of him. He wasn't just a wonderful father and husband, he was someone who never stopped striving for more. Kevin's promotion brought significant improvements to our lives. For the first time, we were able to move into a bigger apartment in a nicer neighborhood, close to an excellent school where Sophia would start the following year. My mom, who now visited openly, often spent time with Sophia and shared updates about my dad. She mentioned that he wasn't doing well, that the lumber business was struggling, and he had grown more isolated. Her words stirred conflicting emotions in me. While the pain of his rejection had dulled, it still lingered, and I wasn't ready to confront those feelings. One afternoon, while walking with Sophia in the park, she asked me why she didn't have a grandpa. Her innocent curiosity caught me off guard, but I answered carefully, explaining that sometimes grown-ups don't get along, even if they're family. Her little face scrunched in thought before she remarked how silly that was, adding that Grandma had told her about Grandpa's woodworking. Her words unlocked memories I hadn't allowed myself to dwell on in years, memories of the intricate wooden toys my father used to make for me, each one crafted with care. A few days later, Kevin came home with incredible news. He had been selected for the internship in Germany. It was an opportunity of a lifetime, and while I was thrilled for him, the thought of managing everything on my own during his 3-month absence was daunting. Still, I knew this was for our future. Kevin reassured me that the sacrifices we'd make now would pay off when he could finally open his own certified service center. While Kevin was away, Sophia and I adapted to a new routine. Every evening, we'd video call him on Skype. Sophia would light up as she shared her preschool adventures and showed him her latest drawings. Despite the distance, Kevin remained a constant presence in her life, and seeing their bond made me even more determined to hold things together. One day, while walking home from preschool, Sophia tripped and scraped her knee badly. Her cries pierced the air, and I panicked, realizing there wasn't a pharmacy or store nearby to grab a bandage. As I scanned the area, my heart sank when I realized we were standing directly across from my parents' house. I hadn't been there in years, and the sight of it brought a flood of emotions, anger, longing, and hesitation. But Sophia's tearful cries pulled me out of my thoughts. Her knee was bleeding, and I couldn't ignore it. With shaky determination, I scooped her up and walked to the familiar door. My heart raced as I pressed the doorbell, the sound echoing louder than I remembered. Footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal my father. He stood there, frozen, his graying hair and lined face evidence of the years that had passed. His eyes widened in recognition, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. I said that my daughter needs help. His eyes moved to Sophia, who was clinging to my shoulder, sniffling softly. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, surprise, pain, maybe even tenderness. Then, after a brief pause, he stepped aside and invited us to come inside. As he finished tending to Sophia's knee, she looked at him with wide, curious eyes, studying him as though trying to piece together this unfamiliar figure in her life. I could see the unspoken questions in her face, but she didn't ask them. Instead, she simply accepted his care, her trust pure and uncomplicated. The sound of footsteps drew my attention, and I turned to see my mom standing in the hallway. Her face lit up when she saw us, her emotions spilling over as she rushed towards Sophia. Scooping her up in a warm embrace, she planted kisses on her cheeks, asking what had happened. Sophia proudly showed off her freshly bandaged knee, proclaiming that her grandpa had fixed it. My mom's gaze shifted to my dad, and for a brief moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. It was a rare moment of unity, and I felt the tension in the room begin to ease. I managed to whisper a thank you, my voice cracking under the weight of everything unsaid. My dad looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and something that resembled hope. After a moment's pause, he invited us to stay for dinner. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to bridge the gap that had grown so wide between us, but Sophia's excited tugging on my hand made the decision for me. We stayed. Dinner that evening was a strange, tentative affair, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken words and lingering wounds. Yet, as Sophia chattered away, sharing stories of her preschool adventures and her dad fixing big German cars, the tension began to melt. My father listened intently, his expression softening with every word she spoke. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the man I had once admired. Sophia's questions broke through the lingering unease, asking about the wooden toys my mom had told her he used to make. Her innocent curiosity brought a faint smile to his face, and when she asked if he could make her a horse like the one I'd had as a child, he nodded. I felt a pang of surprise and nostalgia. Memories of the dark brown wooden horse he had crafted for me flooded back, bittersweet and sharp. True to his word, my father disappeared into his workshop the next day, the rhythmic sounds of hammering and sanding echoing through the house for the next week. On Sunday, he emerged with a beautifully crafted wooden horse on wheels. It was nearly identical to the one I had cherished as a child, but this one was a lighter wood, soft and warm, just like Sophia. Her delight was immediate, her face lighting up as she declared it was exactly like the one her mom had described. From that moment, everything began to shift. Sophia became a regular visitor at my parents' house, her infectious joy breathing life into the spaces that had felt stagnant for so long. My father, who had grown cold and distant, seemed to come alive again, crafting toys for her, reading her stories, and taking her on walks to the park. Slowly, the icy barrier between us began to thaw. When Kevin returned from Germany, I shared everything that had happened during his absence. He listened quietly, his face thoughtful, before sharing a story of his own. He told me about a falling out he had with his father, how he had never found the chance to mend it before his father passed away. His words carried a quiet weight, urging me not to make the same mistake. His perspective stayed with me, giving me the courage to take small but meaningful steps toward rebuilding a fragile connection with my dad. The slow mending of my relationship with my parents was both delicate and transformative. It began with small gestures, quiet conversations over coffee, moments spent watching Sophia play, and the occasional shared meal. But as time went on, the fractures began to heal, piece by piece. My father, once so distant and stubborn, even helped Kevin draft a business plan when he decided to open his own service center. Watching them work together was surreal, but it marked a turning point in our family's journey. One day, my father admitted to Kevin that he had been wrong. He acknowledged Kevin not just as a son-in-law but as a man who had far surpassed his own example as a husband and father. Hearing those words, I felt something unspoken lift between us, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. 10 years passed since the day I left my parents' house with little more than a backpack and a broken heart. Sitting at the same dining table now, I marveled at how much had changed. Kevin sat beside me, his face filled with pride and contentment as the successful owner of his own thriving auto service center. Across from us was Sophia, now a confident and intelligent 10-year-old, full of curiosity and joy. Beside her sat her 7-year-old brother, Michael, who was named after Kevin's late grandfather. The room buzzed with warmth and laughter. On the wall hung the wooden horse, the first gift my father had ever made for Sophia, a symbol of the bond we had rebuilt. Surrounding it were photographs that told the story of our family, our wedding, baby pictures of Sophia and Michael, and moments from family vacations and celebrations. Each image was a testament to the journey we had taken together, from estrangement to reconciliation. My father raised his glass, his voice steady yet full of emotion as he toasted to family. His hair was more gray than black now, and the lines on his face were deeper, but his eyes held a brightness I hadn't seen in years. We all echoed his words, lifting our glasses, and the warmth in the room was almost tangible. Looking around the table, I felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. The struggles and heartbreaks that had once defined our family had been replaced with understanding, love, and unity. Later that evening, Sophia leaned close to me, her voice soft as she shared something that caught me off guard. She told me that Grandpa had cried when he talked to her about the day I left, confessing it was the worst mistake he had ever made. Her words tightened my throat, and I squeezed her hand gently. That moment was a reminder of how far we had come, not just as individuals, but as a family. The violets on the windowsill caught my eye. They were the same ones that had once adorned the small apartment where Kevin and I began our journey. Now, they brought life to my parents' home, a quiet but powerful symbol of how even the humblest beginnings could grow into something beautiful. One evening, not long ago, my father told me something that stayed with me. He admitted that my departure had taught him a lesson he would never forget, that pride should never come before love for your children. He said he was grateful that life had given him the chance to make things right. In his voice, I heard sincerity and a quiet regret that had been replaced by hope and gratitude. As I sat at the dining table that evening, listening to the chatter and laughter of my family, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. For Kevin, whose unwavering love had guided me through the darkest moments. For Sophia and Michael, who reminded me every day what unconditional love truly meant. And for my parents, who had found their way back to us, proving that healing was possible even after years of pain. Love had triumphed over pride, over anger, over everything that had once divided us. As I watched my father laugh with Sophia, my mother help Michael with his dessert, and Kevin's hand resting warmly on mine, I knew this was exactly how it was meant to be. We were a family, not perfect, but whole, having fought, stumbled, and found our way back to one another. This was the life we had built together. This was home. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories and insights. Your support means the world.